Hello, and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. I'm recording video again, so if you'd like to follow along on YouTube, please feel free and welcome if you are checking out the video on YouTube. But if you're just following along on the audio version of the episode of the podcast today, welcome. As I say, I'm your host and I'm a professional mediator by background. And one of the topics that has sometimes come up when I'm doing workplace mediations are discussions around working from home arrangements. Now, I have to say, I am not entirely neutral around this particular topic. I've worked from home myself now for quite a few years. Like I go and do workshops on site with organizations, and sometimes a company will have me come and do, a block of trainings in a week. I might do 3 workshops or something. Or when I'm doing a workplace mediation, I might fly or drive and do it on site, and it's usually 1 or 2 days. But aside from these little blocks, I'm mostly working from home and I absolutely love it. Just little things like you can put on the washing in between doing something else, or when you decide to take a break, you've got all of your cool stuff within reach, like your guitars or your video games or your favorite shows on TV or your comfortable bed that you like to sit in or your shower or whatever. It's just such a no-brainer to me that it is an insanely different level of quality of life. But I'm an extreme introvert, so I have to say that my preference is for working from home, and I could handle just being by myself a lot. Whereas I know for other people, they actually like the interaction and the social aspect of working from home. I've also seen 2 different ways that, the working from home arrangements can go. I know that the research is mixed, and some of the research on open planned offices, for example, show that it really significantly lowers staff efficiency because of the level of distraction, etc. I assume, the constant interruptions, all that kind of stuff. Whereas we think that it's going to increase collaboration, it doesn't necessarily do that. And I think working from home, the obvious benefit is that you can concentrate better and people can focus on tasks and that kind of thing. But when you're home, you've got easy access to your guitars and your video games and your Netflix and your comfy bed and all the rest of it, like I've just said. So the temptation levels can be a little bit different too. Ultimately, I think it probably depends on the person and whether or not a role should be allowed to work from home or not. I suppose that's a challenging decision. I know some organizations have a preference for staff to work on site in the office, especially when they're working as part of a team. But I think if we drill down to the reasons why, it's probably something to do with losing control and then a problem developing that they don't have any capacity to fix, if you know what I mean. Like, I don't think the fear or the concern of letting staff work from home is necessarily this little decision. I think what a lot of organizations are grappling with is the idea of the precedent that might be created from this and how they would still have access to the information that they need to be confident that staff are doing the right thing. I think that's the other element to it. It's like it's going to increase their level of uncertainty. And of course, that's something that we often perceive as a threat. So it makes sense why a lot of bosses' knee-jerk reaction is just to simply say no. So I would like to help you be able to work from home more effectively. And so I've prepared this episode of the podcast to give you some information about how to prepare to negotiate to work from home. I guess it's on your behalf or maybe other people around you. It's on my radar at the moment because my wife's driven over to the office where she works at, and there's literally nobody else there. She's the only person there. So she's driven all the way into this office to work on site in this collaborative way by herself, and she could have very easily be at home in her office that she's got set up here. But anyway, I've been talking to a number of other parents and kids that my son's friends with at school, their parents and that kind of thing. And I know it's a pretty common topic of discussion at the moment coming through COVID. I think that the infrastructure is a little bit more developed in terms of the IT and that kind of thing, but also maybe there's a bit more cultural norms around expectations to be able to have a flexible work environment. So when I do negotiation skills training, I'm just looking over here at some notes that I've prepared for the podcast today. I talk about preparing or thinking about the negotiation at 3 different levels. At the top is power. This is where you might have the formal and the informal sources of power. It could be things like the job market at the moment, like if your boss has easy access to a replacement for you, then they're not going to be too concerned about keeping you happy at the moment. Whereas if you hold a unique type of qualification or credential, or power could be connected to things like expert knowledge, like you might have internal knowledge around the company's history and ways of operating or something like that. Or maybe you can gain some specific type of knowledge around the work that you do, for example. And these are things that are all connected to a concept called BATNA, BATNA. So that BATNA, BATNA, it's an acronym that stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. In other words, if my boss isn't able to convince me to stay in my job, where would that leave them? That's their BATNA. And if I'm not able to, convince my boss to let me work from home, where would that leave me? Now, this idea of BATNA, it's almost like your plan B. Like, what are you going to do if you don't reach a deal with this person that you're negotiating with? There are obviously things that we can do behind the scenes to improve our BATNA, to improve our plan B, like getting a higher level of credential or qualification, like I talked about, or maybe it's exploring the job market and applying for a few jobs and getting some experience doing interviews and that kind of thing. It might be just reaching out and networking and expanding the different connections that you have within the sector that you're working. It might be thinking about options for diversifying, like if you're working in a construction company, thinking about options for working for a supplier, or if you're in a builder, maybe looking at options for working for a government department who's engaging builders to build infrastructure. These are all options that we have for improving our power. And that's often, I think, a helpful starting point when you're preparing for a discussion is thinking about the power dynamics and the power involved. I'm just going to put my screen on Do Not Disturb. I've just suddenly realized that I forgot to do that. So the next level down is the level of rights. This is often formal rights, like job contracts, like what does your actual job description say? When we're thinking about an issue like working from home, you might look at awards for the staff who work in that area, for example. Like, is there an award for teachers or nurses or police or something like that? What does your individual contract say? Maybe there's some type of a collective bargaining agreement that your union has set up on your behalf, for example. You might have access to different kinds of support if you consider joining a union, for example. Maybe there are some type of what would you call it, like a legislative framework or case law precedent or something like that that you can use to argue the case. Like maybe there's like, for example, in Australia, we have things like the Disability Act that governs the way that organisations should support staff who have disabilities. So one of the requirements in that, for example, might be something like flexible work arrangements. So as you're preparing to negotiate, you can increase the level of power that you have by becoming more familiar with all of these different areas behind the scenes. Rights, though, also can be connected to informal types of informal types of arrangements too. These are things like reciprocity, for example. Like maybe you've been in your job for a number of years now and you've moved through a few different sites, and the office that you're working in at the moment is quite a bit further away from your home than the original office when you applied for the job. And you might talk to your boss about the fact that you've been willing to be flexible and you appreciated how at the time that was a transition phase for the business and you didn't want to cause unnecessary disruptions. So you've tolerated it, even though it meant that ultimately you were losing nearly an hour of every day. You've got young kids at the moment, and that's not always easy to manage. And so you wanted to talk to them now about maybe introducing a little bit of give and take in terms of the arrangements moving forward. So that, I think, is quite a lovely way of introducing this idea that, by the way, I've been quite generous to you. I've been doing this extra driving and I haven't complained, or I've put aside my needs because I know that you've had other staff who are unhappy and you've had your hands full managing all of that. Now I wanted to talk about some type of a reciprocal arrangement. Now I wanted to talk about give and take. Now I wanted to talk about clarifying things to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what's expected and where there might be some flexibility there. Like I talk about all of that stuff almost like scales. It's like, hey, let's find a way to talk about what you need. And by the way, here are the things that I need type of thing. And they might be resistant, especially if they're a natural competing kind of person, they might come back at you and say immediately, that's not a conversation that we can have, or that's not a decision I can make, or we've talked about that before. And then you might need to decide how assertive are you in that kind of a situation where they're sort of throwing you off. If it's worth it to you, it might be worth holding your ground and standing firm. So we've got the outside layer of power. Then underneath that, we've got the layer of rights. The inner circle or the inner layer is the layer of interests. This is where we start to think about the things that's like what's actually important to us and what's actually important to our boss as an individual, as well as to the business as a whole. Most of the time, there will be particular reasons why your boss wants you to be in the office. Is it to do with team dynamics? Maybe they're wanting to have a presence for customers and clients when they come into the store. Maybe they're having a concern around decision making processes or that kind of thing. It might be to do with budget, like if they don't use the office, then head office is going to reduce the amount of money that they can spend on physical space or something like that. Think about what's actually important for them, because they will be the levers that you need to negotiate around when it comes to actually generating options. And then you might also think about what's important to you. And for both of these things, you can think about them in terms of like low priority, medium priority, high priority. Or you could think about it in terms of short term, medium term, long term. Like in the next 3 months, what's important for the business right now? And within your team, what's important for the business right now? If you've got a few new staff, for example, then one of the interests that your boss will have is to make sure that they can get support. So as you're going in to negotiate options for working from home, you will need to figure out a way to reassure them that you will still be able to give them the same kind of support. So maybe letting them know that you've set up a special email address that you can use, or you'll call them once a day after lunch and check in if there's any questions. It doesn't particularly matter what the option is, but you'll need to figure out a way to address it. Because if you don't, that will be sitting there as an excuse in your boss's head as to why they should reject your request. So that's the first step for me. Is I think about the power, the rights, and the interests that's involved. I sometimes write that down, and if I'm having the benefit of having someone else to talk to, then I might sit down and go through it together with them too. We could also think about this negotiation in terms of the 5 types of conflict: relationship conflict, but then we've also got data, interests, values, and structure. So, data conflict, if we approach the work from home negotiations from a data lens, we might be letting them know about precedent, for example, other companies who have let staff work from home and what the evidence shows in terms of productivity. And what do you know? It had this huge benefit in terms of staff well-being or mental health or whatever the thing is. So that's the data. That's where we're talking about facts. But we can also connect this to interests. Interest conflict is similar to that interest layer as we're preparing for a negotiation. What's important to you and what's important to them? So if they have an agenda of supporting their staff and workplace well-being, something that they're going on about in terms of their values as an organization, then let them know, hey, this is a really good opportunity to put your money where your mouth is. We know that the evidence is that this improves staff well-being when they can work from home. This is the minimum required. It's 2 days or something like that a week. That's all I'm asking for. I know that you're wanting to find options for supporting your staff, so this seems to be aligned with the organization's values. What do you think? So we're moving there from the data stuff of I'm right because this, or you should do this because this, to the interest stuff, which is what's actually important to them. And then we might even connect it to values as well. Now, obviously, for a decision like working from home, structural conflict will also be an incredibly important element to consider. So you might need to think through things like, how will you arrange meetings? If you did work from home, what kind of things might need to be reorganized or restructured? How can you give your boss, if that's the person that's making the decision, the feeling that things are under control? They might have a dashboard or something like that they can look at as to what staff's up to or who's logged in or what people are doing. Like, you'll need to decide strategically, really, how flexible you are around all of these different elements. But if you're able to offer them some types of structural interventions, it often goes a long way for getting buy-in. So, the final way that we might think about negotiating from home is thinking about your boss as the individual. Like, what's important to them? Are they aiming to get a promotion at the moment? Like that would inform their interests and all that kind of stuff. But you might also think about things like their personality type. If your boss is a real, like what you would call a red personality type, like very efficient and results oriented and outcome driven and let's make a decision and get on with it kind of thing. We want to make sure that we're working together efficiently. What they're often triggered by is uncertainty and inefficiency. So as you're negotiating working from home, they will be the likely touch points for them, I guess. So you might need to think about what you can offer them or the kinds of proposals or what they need to see or hear from you to lower that sense of perceived threat. Whether or not they realize that's what's triggering them, it's very likely that it would be. But the blue types of personalities, the very data focused, detail oriented people that you might have, they are not so concerned about the uncertainty and inefficiency. They're concerned about things like the lack of detail or the inaccuracy. Like when you say you're going to be working from home on specific tasks, which tasks will you be doing? The blue person would want access to the dashboard to know who's logged in, whereas the red person just wants to know that the deadlines are being met at the end of the week. So there's two different motivations there, and you don't want to make the mistake of assuming that everybody thinks the way that you do. So we've got the red and the blue personality types, so to speak. I tend to use a personality model called insight discovery when I'm going through personality training and as part of conflict resolution skills. Yellow is the next one. You want to have influence, you really value discussion. I would put myself in the yellow category. I like to be admired. I like other people around to think that I'm doing a good job and that I know what I'm doing and all that kind of stuff. Like I really like the fact that people come to me after workshops and say that it changed their life or it was the best one that they've ever done or something like that. Like it hugely drives my ego more than just the money or the, whatever the individual metrics are that other people might look at. The green type of personality, that's the last type. It's the very social, harmonious type of person. They like to go with the flow. They don't like conflict or tension between them and other people. They like things to have a positive, good vibe within the team. They like an air generally of lightness and just pleasantness, like talking about how was your weekend and all that kind of stuff. And if your boss is a green type of personality and you're asking them to work from home, it's possible they might even be a little bit upset about the fact that they won't get to hang out with you as much. So maybe saying, let's organize a monthly lunch or something like that might go a long way to satiate that concern that they've got. But it could be also valid things like, I know that for you, one of the factors you'll need to consider, boss, is how to make sure that this team is still working in a coherent way. So I'd be very open to hear your thoughts around what might be needed in that aspect. Or I know that when we have new staff coming on board, or maybe you've got people on leave or off sick, we might not necessarily be able to continue the working from home, but could we organise a time to discuss a sort of a default arrangement and then we can adapt or adjust from that as needed? What do you think? So how does that sit with you, thinking about negotiating that decision around working from home in that way, starting with the general idea of the negotiation levels, power, rights, and interests, then moving to the 5 types of conflict, the data conflict, interest conflict, values, structure, and relationship. And then finally, especially in terms of the relationship element, the personality of the people involved, the red personalities that might be triggered by the uncertainty and inefficiency, the blue that might be triggered by different things like lack of detail, inaccuracy, errors, and mistakes, especially when they might worry that they're going to look responsible for something going wrong. The yellow people that want to have influence, they want to have discussion, they want, a different set of motivations for them. And then the green people that want a harmonious team, and they've probably got some type of a preconception around what that should look like, quote unquote. Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or one of the big podcast platforms, you can now leave a comment. So I'd love to know what stood out to you, what you're taking away from the episode today. You'll see in the show notes, there's this cool little thing now where you can send me a text message. I don't think I'm able to reply. I just get the message and the name that comes through, but please feel free to experiment and have a go with those. I'm starting to get lovely little text messages coming through, which I have to say is just fantastic. And if you've got a question, an idea for a future episode of the podcast, you can visit my website, simongoode.com. It's SIMONGOODE.com. Well, thank you very much for listening and all the best. And I hope to see you again in a future episode of the Conflict Skills Podcast. Bye for now.